Hello and welcome. You're watching News9. We're bringing you all the live updates from G20 as the day 2 kicks in and the G20 delegates, heads of states gather for the final session of the G20 summit, which essentially talks about one future for all developed economies, all economies and their leaders who are here in the national capital, which is the culmination of 6 to 8 months long initiatives, meetings, of working groups, various fractions converging today to give it a send-off, so to say. We'll bring you all the updates as we continue to do so. With me are my colleagues Krishna, Kumar, Kartik, Malhotra. Gentlemen, very warm Sunday morning.
To you too, Shweta.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't say
not very warm considering all the rain around us, but
a relatively cooler Sunday morning.
Yeah,
and as the New Delhi braces for rain, I'm not sure if that has hampered what was on the agenda. This morning we saw all delegates moving to pay their homage to Mahatma Gandhi, post which they proceeded for the third and the final session of the G20 summit. The session is currently on, and I think the summit culminated in a way yesterday, Kartik.
Record time, was it, Krishna? I don't know. I mean, you know, the session, you had dignitaries walking in, what, 9:30 a.m. onwards. We were in the studio as we had live visuals of dignitaries walking in. And 3:30, we knew that there is going to be a press conference and the declaration has been adopted, has been signed by all countries, even Russia and China in absentia.
What a win for India.
So, I think it's a great win, and whatever doubts that people had that, hey, is there going to be a consensus or not? Too many items on agenda, are they going to be ticked off the list? I think the declaration pretty much captures the essence of whatever was slated to be signed, to be adopted, to be agreed upon, and a unanimous consensus reached, arrived at, signed, sealed, yet to be delivered. I think, you know, you've got to understand that these declarations, these agreements, these memoranda, you agree to cooperate, you agree to develop a framework. What is that framework going to look like? How is that going to be implemented? And hence, I think all these summits, the time frame. So I think all these summits, including G20, G7, WTO, BRICS summit, you know, whatever you have, you've got to look at them in a complete unstoppable continuum. It's not that the end of one summit really lets you arrive at something that you have achieved. What you've really achieved is just an agreement. And I think there's greater cooperation within the bloc. The bloc and the countries outside of the bloc will have to continue year after year after year, and these are not goals that are going to be, achieved in a short term, and they will have to keep evolving.
After that record declaration, Kartik, Krishna, there was a meeting where Sherpa, the foreign minister, the finance minister, and a host of people who were responsible for arriving at that consensus converged and talked about the key takeaways, which is what we are hoping to tell our viewers here. What came out of day one, essentially, what came out of day one will encompass overall of what came out of the G20 summit. A lot of points were agreed on. Let's take them up one after the other. I think the most important point, at least from financial point of view, is an agreement on multilateral banks. What's the future going to be for multilateral banks, and a need for reforms?
So, Shweta, I think, again, we were talking about tangibles and what comes out tangibly from any of these agreements or any of these, consensus that the G20 countries arrive at. I think in terms of consensus on the MDB reforms, there are some very, very clear guidelines set. And one of these is that the reforms within the MDBs themselves are no longer going to be the onus and responsibility of countries infusing their own government capital into keeping liquidity in these MDBs. And what is being agreed upon is that MDBs now should look at a hybrid sort of a model where private capital also comes in, where you look at an ecosystem, creating an ecosystem where private capital comes in, hybrid financing models come in, and you really make it work actually like a bank and not just as a charity organization.
Right.
So it's not that it's the onus of the US or the UK or the other rich, cash-rich countries to infuse capital into MDBs. And that capital being deployed in developing economies and emerging markets, but rather a more open marketplace sort of a model comes into play, where private capital infusion comes in. MDBs are strengthened to take capital from outside of the government ecosystem, get private players to participate and really make it run like a non-profit but yet a business. So there has to be greater accountability, greater transparency, greater returns to shareholders. If you've taken private capital from a certain bank, you've got to pay that bank back in interest. And that deployment of capital which you're doing in developed economies, in emerging markets, also needs to generate some sort of a return for MDBs.
Absolutely.
When it comes to those countries where this capital has been planted, to really make some virtue of the money that they have received. So a hybrid model where there is greater cooperation between government funding of MDBs as well as MDBs seeking private capital to add to liquidity and then deploying them in a more transparent manner, and where the terms of negotiation between how this debt is going to be repaid, where this debt to emerging markets and developing economies is going to be used, and what are the broader contours of development has to be agreed upon between the MDBs and the countries that receive that grant.
All right, but let's quickly dip into what Finance Minister said while announcing the key takeaways of the New Delhi Declaration.
Of an independent panel on capital adequacy framework of the MDBs. So the CAF recommendations are focused on enabling MDBs to use their existing resources effectively. The roadmap estimates, this is going to be of interest for the media, the roadmap estimates that implementation of the CAF and the measures thereby will potentially yield additional lending headroom of approximately $200 billion over the next decade. So through these achievements, India has harnessed the opportunity provided by the G20 presidency to effectively articulate and embed the priorities of the Global South in the larger global conversation on the MDB reforms. I move to the second, laying the building blocks for a globally coordinated and comprehensive policy and regulatory framework for crypto assets. The global push for clearer policies on crypto assets has gained momentum under the Indian presidency, and a global consensus is emerging on the same. The presidency will support the IMF and the FSB and FSB is also setting the contours of the regulatory framework for a globally coordinated approach to crypto assets. So the presidency, with the support of IMF and the FSB, is setting these contours. The IMF and FSB synthesis paper, about which I've spoken to the media earlier, including a roadmap. On that, I just want to give my observation. This synthesis paper delves into how the policy and regulatory frameworks developed by the IMF and the FSB, alongside the other standard-setting bodies, will fit together and interact with each other.
All right, so that of course are the key takeaways from finance track, at least two of them, which is multilateral development banks and the need for development banks, the reforms, and how it's not charity. I think charity is an important word you used, Kartik. It's going to stay with me for a while after this bulletin. Essentially, charity is what it was looked at in a way when you had global financial institutions being hegemonized by certain Western blocs, and money would be dispersed as per whims and fancies of these Western blocs. You need banks and you need institutions which are outside of the, these Western bloc controlled financial institutions, and that is where multilateral development banks will help countries, especially African Union and a lot of South Asian countries which need money on an urgent basis.
You're right, Shweta. So exactly, I think, the whole consensus is that these MDBs, whether it is the World Bank or the IMF or the ADB or whatever you have, they've got to work as concrete businesses, but they're not in the business of making profits. They're in the business of returning value back to their creditors, back to institutions that they themselves lend from, to offer that debt to emerging economies.
And so as opposed to one country paying you,
it's not one.
it's
I mean,
a
there's always
bank.
been a block of countries. So, for
Right.
example, 2 weeks before the G20 summit, US had pledged to invest or to sort of, offer another 25 billion to MDBs. Now, this US, grant to IMF and World Bank, the $25 billion is the money of the US Treasury, is the money of the US taxpayers. Now, the idea is that if you infuse a hybrid model here, you'll get private banks to also be in a position to lend to these MDBs,
Right.
and thereby making these MDBs accountable to return the capital and the interest back to the
countries.
capital, back to the lenders that they have received this grant from.
Right.
So the objective is still not for the MDBs to actually make money, but run it like a business with the transparency, with the accountability of businesses, where you have taken money from, you have lent money and you have further lent it to another country in this case. And then when you get the return from that country, because this debt has to be repaid, it's not a grant, it's a debt.
Right.
You are lending money
which
to
is
these
where I think
emerging
it's
markets.
different from, China perhaps lending to different countries and also using it as a tool to control them geopolitically.
Yeah, so technically even the grant that China gives or the debt that China gives, let's say to a Sri Lanka, right, the objective there is that Sri Lanka will either pay back in cash with interest, or will lose control
Right.
of a few of its assets. Those assets could include ports,
Right.
those assets could include some mining blocks.
And their decision-making, independent decision-making abilities as well.
With respect to the assets that they
Right.
mortgage in this
Right.
case, right? So it's a mortgage system.
Okay.